Welcome to 2011 TMT Predictions. We're focusing today on the media sector. I'm Janet Moran, and I'm joined here by my colleagues Duncan Stewart and Paul Lee. So, hello fellows, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Let's talk about the television industry. We've been hearing a lot of debate over the last few years. Consumers have new devices, new ways of viewing programming. What is the future of the television as we know it, the historical TV set that sits in our living rooms? What is the future of that industry?
Well, if we just look, say, a couple of years back, when the economy wasn't doing as well as it is this year, then a lot of the speculation around television was, this was an industry in decline. There were less people who were going to be watching it, less advertising revenue. But what we're seeing actually is the outlook for television looks pretty strong. There's more viewing than ever before. There's more viewers coming on board. So the outlook is pretty good, particularly in BRIC countries.
Very interesting. Now, what about advertising revenues? I mean, we used to have TV commercials that were interspersed between our programs. Now consumers have the ability with their DVRs to time shift and skip over commercials. Do we see a lot of that time skipping and time shifting?
Well, what we're seeing for 2011 is that the DVR, which is, gives us the ability to skip over adverts, is probably going to reach over 50% of homes in the UK, in the US. So in theory, we could skip over a lot of adverts and really do damage to the advertising sector. What we're actually seeing, though, is that the majority of homes which do have DVRs actually watch the majority of their television live. And those who do skip over adverts still get a value in terms of seeing the adverts, but watched in fast motion. And it's the last advert that they actually watch which has the greatest value now to advertisers.
So although consumers can shift and skip commercials, you're finding they don't?
Yeah, that's what we're finding.
And even when they do, very often, there's some interesting details. If you've ever seen somebody fast forwarding through, they want to make sure they don't miss any of their programs, so they often slow down during the last commercial, the one just before the break has ended, and they end up watching all of that, or they fast forward and then they rewind and they actually end up seeing the same commercial twice. We're also seeing a shift in how television ads are designed. Although ad skipping isn't everywhere, some people do it, and so ads are now being designed in a more graphical way, so that even if you are fast forwarding, you can still retain a lot of the images, the brand, and the message that the commercial is trying to convey.
So we'll still see commercials, and we'll maybe see higher values for certain placement times that commercials are interposed between programming.
All of which are adding to the value. The phrase that, if you remember George Orwell's Animal Farm, I paraphrase that. So when we look at traditional media, all media may be equal, but some are more equal than others. And television is very much holding its value, holding the ad value, and holding the number of hours and audience share versus some of the other media that we see out there.
Do you think that will change based on the generation? Now, whereas I can see my generation still watching television, I do know that the younger generation, I do have children, they are viewing television programming from the internet sites. Do you see a difference in the generations, or you think just by large, the television will still exist for the near future?
It's really difficult to separate generational shifts that will continue as that generation turns from 18-year-olds to 28-year-olds. One example that I often use is that my daughter and her boyfriend both watch a lot of TV over the internet because he lives at his parents' house and she lives at her parents' house. If they end up moving in together in a year or two, they're not going to sit in different rooms watching streaming video over the internet. They're probably going to sit on a sofa and watch the shows together. So separating out future viewing habits at this point, it's probably too early to tell.
And what kind of impact does the technology embedded in the new televisions impact this? I mean, the HD TV and the 3D television, how does that impact our desire to still retain a television?
In terms of HD TVs, there are tens of millions of HD TVs being sold every single year. And a lot of them, though, aren't yet connected to an HD source, for example, like a Blu-ray player or an HD subscription. So when that actually does happen, what people tend to find is they're even more compelled to watch television. And there is a virtuous cycle in that there is more and more content being created in HD. So for a few more years, we should see people watching more television because it's more visually arresting. And in terms of 3D, we had a prediction around that last year. We see it more as a medium-term objective, so it's quite difficult to film. There's a lot of learning going on as to exactly where to put, for example, in a sports arena, where do you put the cameras? Do you put them on the top of the stadium, or do you put them at ground level? So there's lots of learning going on, and it's more of a 5-year time horizon.
Very good. You know, we touched a little bit about advertising and how that's being impacted. Let's talk about advertising and how it's being impacted by the internet. You know, historically, we had this model, this metric model of CPMs, you know, cost per thousand, and advertisers were used to getting and paying a certain amount of money for that CPM rate. Now we see the CPM rates being driven down to below the dollar level in some instances, pennies on the dollar in fact. So how is that impact of the dropping CPM rates going to affect the whole advertising industry, the content providers, and the media industry at large?
So what hasn't happened yet is the CPMs at traditional media are measured usually in the tens of dollars. Online display ads are measured in single dollars, and in the social network ads are the ones that are measured in dimes or pennies on the dollar. What hasn't happened yet is that the rise of the social network advertising slice has not yet put that much pressure, it seems, on traditional media CPM or CPM equivalent. What there is a danger of is that that could happen in the future. That's called the process of innovative disruption. A new entrant comes in at a low price point. Not only do they gain share, but because of that new lower price point, they move the price point down for everybody in the whole industry. Were that to happen, not only would we see traditional advertising and other forms of online advertising continue to lose share to social network or whoever the new low-priced entrant is, we could see the entire industry contract in dollar terms. Now that hasn't started happening yet. Advertising is up year over year, but that is a danger going forward as these new online ad metrics perhaps could be innovatively disrupting the entire ad ecosystem.
You know, one of your predictions talks about advertising as it relates to social networking as being disproportionately low. I mean, the revenue, I think you say, is 1% of ad revenues for global ad revenues are attributable to social networks. So is the future revenue model for a social network going to be ad revenues or subscription revenues, or is it going to be something else like microtransactions? What is the future revenue model of the social network site?
Well, for 2011, what's very clear is that advertising dominates, and you know, the amounts are small relative to the global total. So, as you're saying, under 1%, but that's still $5 billion. So it's not to be sniffed at. But in terms of where you go from there, then you perhaps have to start looking at new revenue streams. So when we look at CPM, so the cost which they charge that, you know, we could even see the CPMs going lower than the 40 cents or so which they've been over the past year. So you might have to start looking at alternative ways of monetizing the fantastic customer base that you've got, the reach, the insight that you have into clients. And it could be e-commerce, it could be renting out your platforms to other providers.
Although one note, although that will almost certainly happen, even at those very low CPMs, 40, 50 cents, those social network advertisers are still very profitable. Their cost of manufacturing that inventory is still much, much lower, even than 40 or 50 cents. So their profit margins are very high, even if the absolute dollars may be lower than some people were expecting.
Well, we've just talked about some changing revenue models. Let's talk about the music industry, okay? Where, you know, what's going to happen to the CD? I mean, we have a completely different industry there. We've seen now for the first time in 2011, you predict that online digital music sales will surpass physical hard disk CD sales. What's going to happen to the CD? Is it going to be like my vinyl records that are in my closet and I take out and hug once in a while? Or what is the future of the CD?
I mean, one thing to be clear about for 2011 is that what we're not seeing is digital music revenues rising very quickly. It's more the physical music revenues declining very, very quickly. So that's what we're seeing. And we do have this issue whereby when do people buy music? It used to be all year round, and it's becoming concentrated into the last quarter of the year, when people are giving gifts. So one thing we may see is retail for music changing quite radically, and a move to music just being sold when people aren't looking to buy gifts, so just in the fourth quarter of the year. So a different retail model where you even get pop-up stores just appearing and disappearing according to when people actually want to buy the product. And as for vinyl, that's been in a bit of a renaissance over the last few years.
I know.
But that renaissance is going from about 1 million units in the US to about 2.5 million units in the US. So, it's a big percentage increase, but
only for those of us who are nostalgic.
Exactly, and the unit value has gone up tremendously. With a CD, could you also see that? Possibly, with good packaging, people still like tangible materials, But what seems to be quite clear is the long-run trend is the physical model. It is really struggling.
So I should still hang on to my Led Zeppelin and Moody Blues and all of my former
Give you a
albums.
good price for those.
Okay. Well, thank you. Now let's talk about live music and live performance. What is the future of that industry? I mean, we used to have a lot of those costs being borne by the record companies and the artists, and now we have these new companies that are, completely 360, taking over the artist and its copyright and everything around that, and selling it in a different way. What is the future of that industry?
Well, live had a really good decade in the 90s, and it had an even better decade, the one just passed. So, the increases in revenues have been double-digit or at least single-digit, despite the state of the economic cycle. When you look to the next decade, one of the challenges is, so who is bringing in the most live revenue? And a lot of those who have brought in a lot of the live revenue over the last decade are going to be in their 60s this year. So to what extent can they keep on touring? And how do you bring in the new talent which can sell those tickets over the coming years? That is one of the big challenges.
So the labels traditionally have spent billions of dollars on A&R, artist and repertoire, each year. And just as a result of the falling profits and revenues of the traditional recorded music segment, that has become an increasingly difficult burden for them to bear. It's about 15% of their total revenue. So as revenues have dropped, the amount of A&R spending has dropped. Who is going to replace it? You've already mentioned 360 spending, but it's going to be a concert. Festival promoters are going to need to encourage the new acts who are going to be headlining next year's festivals. We're seeing the artists themselves sometimes getting together, older, more mature artists sponsoring younger ones. And of course we have the rise of reality television, some of which have turned into almost a factory for producing perhaps not the stars of the magnitude that we have been seeing, but nonetheless people who in almost a prepackaged way can produce a live music tour and revenue stream at a relatively effective cost.
Well, now I've saved my most interesting topic for last. And it's interesting to me because every weekend I have a house full of teenagers doing this thing called online gaming. And, I was just getting caught up with the whole hardware aspect of gaming and buying these boxes and having my children buy software associated with that. And now I understand that all of this is being done online. The models are changing. It's not necessarily subscription as maybe that's the major revenue driver, but there's these microtransactions and all of this other revenue coming through this industry. Tell me about the gaming industry. I am really intrigued.
So we have to kind of go back a couple of years and talk about what the industry looked like, let's say in 2005. It was an industry where people went out and bought consoles or computers. They bought the latest, greatest games, and there was a cycle. There was a cycle of graphics chips, there was a cycle of consoles, new generations every 5 or 10 years, and they bought almost all the games in hard form, and there were problems with that, a bunch of problems. One, that console cycle made the industry quite cyclical, and that was a big problem for the industry. But the other is, if I can create a disc that I can sell to somebody, they can very often pirate that disc, and piracy was costing the industry, it is believed, tens of billions of dollars annually. So two things have gone on. One is you've connected all of these games, and as you connect them, you remove a lot of the ability to pirate. If you want to have a massive multiplayer online game, once you're online, they can verify that you have in fact legitimately paid and subscribed for your game. Next, it shifts the model a little bit away from the console and a lot away from the sale of a one-time license. So we have subscriptions, we have free-to-play, we have microtransactions, we have even, it's still early, but gaming in the cloud, where I could use something like a netbook to actually play a high-end game, but out there with all the service in the cloud. And that shift from a license and hardware model to more of a service and subscription model should make for a more sustainable, less volatile, and hopefully more profitable industry for gaming at large.
And as you know, I'm a tax professional, so as you speak about all of these new revenue models, I'm always thinking, how is this impacted by the tax law? And what are the tax laws going to do about these transactions that occur in everywhere rather than in a specific state? We used to follow very physical, traditional ways of tracking where people are and where companies have to pay taxes. And now, with all of this taking place online, the laws are up in the air. Physical presence doesn't necessarily exist for someone to have to pay taxes to a jurisdiction. So there's just a whole range of things and opportunities and issues that are coming out of all of these new media predictions and issues. And I thank you so much for joining us and giving us all of your insight.
Thank you, Jen.
A pleasure.